This one is part of a short series I'm going to do on flies that you can fish for brown trout on a regular basis. This white miller was meant to imitate a miller moth, and it's used in night fishing. Andy Brasco, who does wonderful versions of these old wet flies from Bergman, fishes a version of this with no tail. One of the flies, one of the white millers done in Bergman, in the Bergman book Trout, and claims it's very effective when the moths are around, usually midsummer. This hook is an old Mustad 3908. Any sprout bend number 8 or number 10 will work for this. And the thread I'm using here is Benecki 12-aught white. I'm doing the version of this fly that I remember best from fly shops back in the 60s. Always had a silver tag, always had a tail consisting of red hackle, fairly stiff, so I would use cock hackle. This is silver, flat silver tinsel, 5 turns back, 5 turns back forward. Backing off the thread. And as always, bind everything down underneath the hook. This tinsel is metal, and the size of this particular tinsel is small. This is Lagarton. You can cut these butts at any point you'd like. A lot of times I like to bind the butts down almost the whole length of the hook, just to keep everything even. On this fly, it's less important. And I want a tapered body on this, so I'm flattening the thread, spinning it counterclockwise as if you're unscrewing a light bulb, building starting to build a little bit of a body. And I typically do this as I go. I don't do it all at once. And we'll go back all the way to the tag and get ready to put the hackle on. For a fishing fly, I don't want a really long tail. I want it to be about shank length. Sometimes I'll go a little longer on a display fly just because it's a nice effect. But for fishing these, I want about shank length. And when I'm doing cock hackle at the tail, I just roll it onto the top of the hook, and I didn't quite get it far enough. I'll go again with it. And that's going to work. When I'm binding the tail fibers down, I always tend to keep the tail itself up. And that goes for if I'm approaching the tail with the thread. It tends to help with thread torque and keeps the fibers together. Notice how up towards the front of the fly, I staggered the thread. I never go back to the same place twice. And the whole idea here is just to minimize bulk near the head. I'm always thinking about building a taper that's fatter in the middle and more tapered towards the eye, as well as more tapered towards the tail, fattest in the middle. All right, that'll work. I did a little saliva on the tail just to keep it together. On this particular fly, I really don't want a lot of spread in the tail. You'll get some regardless. Okay, I've tied in the tinsel, flat tinsel again, flat silver with one turn of thread. And now I'm tying in 2 strands of Danville rayon floss, white. I've tried to cut those at an angle. I really wasn't very successful. In order to promote the taper I want, those butts. And I think that's probably enough bodybuilding for now. We'll take it back and forward. I have not sped up any of this. Just in case somebody wanted to see the whole process. Normally I would speed that up. You can do this floss 2 ways. You can tie a long single strand in at the front and then run it all the way back and all the way forward, or you can do 2 strands at the back. Either way works beautifully. When I do 2 strands, I overlap slightly when I come forward, just slightly. In other words, I'm not wrapping this edge to edge. If I wrap a single strand starting at the front, I'll go edge to edge all the way back and then overlap slightly on the winding it forward. I'm going for a pretty small head on this fly, so I've only trapped that floss twice. And in order to keep the spacing on this tinsel more or less even, it doesn't have to be exact, but try to get it as close as you can. The important thing to remember is keep the angle the same the whole time you're wrapping. And I wound up with 6 turns of tinsel on this rather than the requisite 5. But it's a fishing fly. I don't care. As long as I'm in that 5 ballpark, I'm fine with it. 4, 5, 6. On a smaller fly, and I do a lot of wet flies fairly small, size 16, which is a small wet. 4 at the most on those. Tying in the hackle, stroking it back. This is very confident. This is, I'm sorry, I was going to say this is Whiting American. This is not. This is just some white, inexpensive, wapsie hen hackle that I got from Blue Quill Angler. $7. for a whole neck of this stuff, and it's great. You don't have to spend a lot of money on these flies, which is nice, especially if you're poor like I am. When I get in there with the scissors these days, I'm using the tips and I'm kind of feeling for the stem when I cut this off. When I cut the stem off, just sort of try to feel for it. You can be very, very accurate, and you won't have any strays if you do it right. And now I'm pulling everything down into a beard and binding it down with just a couple of wraps, trying to keep thread wraps to a minimum. Switching now to black thread. I definitely want it to be white when I'm binding down that hackle into a beard. So when you switch to the black, you have to be mindful of things like that. You don't want to switch too early. And the last thing we put on is a pair of wings. These are cut from duck quills, white duck quills, a right and a left. Tips up and tips together in this version I'm doing here. This is the way I remember them from when I was a kid. This was a very popular fly in the Adirondacks. You could get these anywhere. You could get these in a dry version as well. I'm trying to keep this wing low and not doing a very high wing. This is probably, it's definitely less than a gap width wide. Maybe 3/4 gap width. On fishing flies, typically you don't want a huge wing. Although, for these, if you're imitating a moth, maybe you do. I don't know. The other thing you could use this fly for, I think, and I can't prove it from my experience, but is the Leucon, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Leukon hatch that occurs mid-July here in the Midwest for sure. I've experienced a Leucon hatch, and it was a study in humiliation that evening. I remember it was a tough hatch. It would have been great if I'd had a white miller that night, but alas, I did not. And here's the finished fly with the head glued up. I did one round of penetrating cement and then some Sally Hansen's at the head. And I think this one will fish. See how low that wing is. That's what I want. Have fun with this.